The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the dusty station house, and Zelda Crawford pressed one trembling hand against her swollen belly as she peered through the grimy window at Fort Worth, Texas, a town that looked just as rough and unforgiving as she had feared. It was late summer in 1876, and the heat shimmered off the packed earth streets like waves of desperation, matching the churning anxiety in her chest as she contemplated the lie she was about to live. She had answered Samuel Norton's advertisement for a mail-order bride 3 months ago, pouring her heart into careful letters that painted her as a respectable widow seeking a fresh start out west, conveniently omitting the truth that would have sent any decent man running. She was 5 months pregnant with a child conceived in shame, the product of a Boston merchant's son who had promised marriage and delivered only abandonment when she told him about the baby. The stagecoach driver opened the door and offered his weathered hand to help her down, his eyes flickering briefly to her midsection before he looked away with practiced politeness. Zelda had done her best to conceal her condition with carefully arranged shawls and a loosely fitted traveling dress, but she knew that her secret would not remain hidden much longer. Perhaps another month, if she was fortunate, before her body betrayed the truth she had been so desperate to hide. She stepped onto the wooden boardwalk with as much dignity as she could muster, her carpetbag clutched in one gloved hand, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Fort Worth was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of rough-hewn buildings clustered along a main street that seemed to stretch endlessly into the vast Texas prairie. Cowboys lounged outside saloons, their spurs catching the afternoon sunlight, while women in calico dresses hurried past with baskets over their arms. The air smelled of horse manure, dust, and something cooking that made her empty stomach clench with hunger. She had barely eaten during the long journey from Boston, too nervous about meeting Samuel and too sick with morning illness that stubbornly persisted well into the afternoon. A tall man detached himself from the shadow of the general store and walked toward her, with the loose-hipped gait of someone who spent more time on horseback than on foot. Zelda's breath caught as she took in Samuel Norton for the first time in person, finding him both exactly as his letters had described, and somehow completely different. He was perhaps 28 years old, with sun-darkened skin and pale blue eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed facade. His brown hair curled slightly beneath his hat, and his face was all hard angles and strong lines, the face of a man who had carved out a life in an unforgiving land through sheer determination. "Miss Crawford." His voice was low and rough, like whiskey poured over gravel, and something in Zelda's chest tightened at the sound of it. "Mr. Norton." She managed a smile that felt brittle on her lips. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you in person." He removed his hat, revealing more of that unruly brown hair, and studied her with an intensity that made her want to squirm. For a long moment, she was certain he could see everything, that he knew about the baby and the lies and the desperate circumstances that had driven her halfway across the country to marry a stranger. But then his expression softened slightly, and he nodded toward the street. "Welcome to Fort Worth. I hope the journey was not too difficult. It was long, but I am grateful to be here." Another lie stacked atop all the others, though this one felt less heavy on her tongue. Samuel retrieved her carpetbag and a battered trunk that the driver had hauled down from the top of the coach, handling both with an easy strength that spoke of years of hard physical labor. "I thought we might get you settled at the boarding house tonight, let you rest from your travels. We can go to the church tomorrow morning if that suits you." Tomorrow morning. In less than a day, she would be married to this man, bound to him by law and before God, and he still did not know the truth. Zelda's throat tightened, but she forced herself to nod. That would be fine, thank you. The boarding house was a two-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch, run by a formidable woman named Mrs. Henderson, who looked Zelda up and down with shrewd eyes before showing her to a small but clean room on the second floor. Samuel paid for the night and promised to return in the morning, tipping his hat to her once more before disappearing down the stairs with that same purposeful stride. Zelda stood at the window and watched him walk back down the street, his broad shoulders set against the fading daylight, and wondered what kind of man she was about to marry. She did not sleep well that night. The baby moved restlessly inside her, tiny flutters that reminded her of bird wings, and her mind spun through 100 different scenarios of how tomorrow might unfold. Perhaps Samuel would notice her condition as soon as they stood together in the church. Perhaps he would realize the truth during the ceremony and stop the preacher mid-sentence, denouncing her before the entire congregation. Perhaps he would marry her and then cast her out as soon as he discovered her deception, leaving her alone and abandoned in a strange town with nowhere to turn. When dawn finally crept through the thin curtains, Zelda rose and dressed with trembling hands in the nicest dress she owned, a deep blue cotton that matched her eyes and still fit reasonably well if she did not lace her corset too tightly. She brushed her dark hair until it shone and pinned it up in a simple style, then studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washbasin. She looked pale and frightened, her eyes too large in her face, shadows beneath them from the sleepless night. Not at all like a blushing bride should look on her wedding day. Samuel arrived precisely when he had promised, wearing what appeared to be his Sunday best, a clean shirt and vest with his least dusty boots. He offered her his arm with a quiet courtesy that made her feel even worse about the lies between them, and together they walked to the small whitewashed church at the end of the main street. The preacher was a thin man with kind eyes who asked no questions and seemed accustomed to performing hasty marriages for mail-order couples. There were no other guests, just Mrs. Henderson and her husband serving as witnesses, their faces curious but not unkind. The ceremony was brief and simple, the familiar words washing over Zelda like water while she stood beside Samuel and promised to love, honor, and obey him until death parted them. His hands were calloused and strong when he slipped a plain gold band onto her finger, and when the preacher instructed him to kiss his bride, Samuel leaned down and pressed his lips to hers so gently that tears pricked at her eyes. It was nothing like the bruising, demanding kisses she had endured from the merchant's son back in Boston. This felt like a promise, tender and careful, and it made her deception feel all the more monstrous. Afterward, Samuel drove her out to his ranch in a wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses, the wheels creaking along a rutted dirt road that led away from town and into rolling grassland dotted with cattle. Zelda sat beside him on the hard wooden seat, her hands folded in her lap, trying to find the courage to speak. She had to tell him. She could not let another hour pass with this terrible secret between them, not when he had just sworn before God to be her husband. "Samuel," she began, her voice barely audible over the jingle of the harness and the creak of the wheels. He glanced at her, those pale blue eyes patient. "You can call me Sam if you like. Most folks do." "Sam," she swallowed hard. "There is something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you before we married, but I was afraid, and I thought perhaps I could hide it, but that was wrong, and you deserve to know the truth." His expression did not change, but she saw his hands tighten slightly on the reins. "Go on." The words stuck in her throat like thorns, but she forced them out. "I am not a widow. I have never been married before today, and I am carrying a child, another man's child. I am 5 months along, and I came here thinking I could deceive you, but I cannot live with this lie between us. If you want to annul the marriage, I would understand. I would not blame you for it." The wagon rolled on for several long moments while Samuel said nothing. Zelda sat frozen beside him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest, waiting for his anger or his disgust or his rejection. But when he finally spoke, his voice was calm and measured, as though she had just told him about the weather. "Is the father going to come looking for you? For the child?" She shook her head quickly. "No, he made it very clear that he wanted nothing to do with either of us. He is from a wealthy Boston family, and his parents would not allow him to marry someone of my station. When I told him about the baby, he gave me money and told me to take care of it myself." The bitterness in her voice surprised her. "Did he hurt you, force himself on you?" "No." She looked down at her hands. "I was foolish enough to believe his promises. The fault was mine as much as his." Samuel was quiet again, and Zelda felt tears burning in her eyes. This was it, then. He would turn the wagon around and take her back to town, leave her at the boarding house with nothing but her carpetbag and her shame. She had gambled everything on this desperate plan, and she had lost. But instead of turning the horses, Samuel kept them moving forward along the dusty road. When he spoke again, his words were so unexpected that Zelda thought she must have misheard him. "A child needs a father. This one will have mine. If you are asking me to raise another man's baby as my own, then I will do it. The child will have my name and my protection, same as if it was born of my blood." Zelda stared at him, unable to comprehend what she was hearing. "You cannot mean that. You do not know me. You owe me nothing." "I know enough." He finally looked at her fully, and the steadiness in his gaze made something crack open inside her chest. "I know you were desperate enough to travel all the way to Texas to marry a stranger. I know you had the courage to tell me the truth when you could have kept lying. And I know that no child deserves to be punished for the circumstances of its birth. If you are willing to be my wife in truth, not just in name, then I am willing to be a father to your child." The tears spilled over then, running down her cheeks in hot tracks. "Why would you do this? You could send me away and find another bride, someone without all this trouble. Because I have been alone on that ranch for 3 years since my parents died, and the loneliness gets to eating at a man after a while. Because I wrote to you hoping for a partner and a companion, and maybe the start of a family. Because everyone deserves a second chance, even foolish girls who believed the wrong man's promises." There was no cruelty in his words, only a quiet kind of understanding that made Zelda's throat ache. She wiped at her eyes with shaking hands. "I do not deserve your kindness, maybe not, but you have got it anyway." He turned his attention back to the road, giving her a moment to collect herself. "We will figure this out together, Zelda. That is what marriage is supposed to be, I reckon. Figuring things out together." The ranch house came into view as they crested a low hill, a sturdy 2-room structure built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney rising from one end. It was not large, but it looked solid and well-maintained, with a barn and several outbuildings visible beyond the house. Cattle grazed in the distance, and the whole scene had a sort of rough beauty that tugged at something in Zelda's chest. This could be her home, if Samuel truly meant what he said. This could be where she raised her child, where she built a new life far away from the judgment and shame that had driven her from Boston. Samuel helped her down from the wagon and carried her trunk into the house, setting it down in the main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room all at once. The furniture was simple but well made, clearly crafted by someone who knew their way around woodworking. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, and windows on either side let in the bright Texas sunlight. Through an open doorway, Zelda could see what appeared to be a bedroom, and her cheeks flushed as she realized that they would be expected to share it tonight. "I know it is not fancy," Samuel said, misinterpreting her silence, "but it keeps the rain out and stays warm enough in winter." "It is perfect," Zelda said honestly. "Thank you for bringing me here, Samuel. Sam, thank you for giving me a chance." He nodded and moved to the fireplace, beginning to build up the fire. "You must be hungry. I am not much of a cook, but I can manage bacon and beans and biscuits if you are not too particular." "That sounds wonderful." She moved to join him, needing something to do with her hands. "I can cook, though. It would be my pleasure to take over that task, if you would like." They worked together in a surprisingly comfortable silence, Zelda discovering where Samuel kept his provisions while he tended the fire and set a heavy iron skillet over the flames. The domesticity of it felt strange and wonderful all at once, this quiet partnership with a man she barely knew but was now bound to for life. When they finally sat down to eat at the rough wooden table, the food was simple but filling, and Zelda realized she was ravenous. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, wanting to know more about this man who had so unexpectedly shown her mercy. "How long have you been raising cattle?" Samuel leaned back in his chair, his long legs stretched out before him. "My father started the ranch about 15 years ago when this area was still pretty rough. He built this house with his own hands, him and my mother working side by side. I was just a boy then, maybe 13 or so. We started with a small herd and built it up over the years. Now I've got about 200 head of cattle, give or take. It is enough to make a decent living, especially with beef prices what they are these days." "What happened to your parents?" Zelda asked gently, his expression clouded. "Fever took them both, winter of '73. First my mother, then my father 3 days later. I think he just did not want to live without her. They were devoted to each other, those two. I have been running the place alone since then, with some help from a couple of ranch hands I hire on during roundup and branding season." "That must have been very difficult losing them both like that." "It was. Still is, some days." He met her eyes across the table. "That is part of why I wanted a wife. This house is too quiet without family in it. A man needs more than just cattle and work to fill his days." Zelda felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over her. "And instead you got a woman carrying another man's child. I am sorry, Sam. You deserved better than this. Stop apologizing." His voice was firm but not unkind. "What is done is done. We move forward from here, agreed?" "Agreed," she whispered. That night, Samuel insisted on sleeping in the main room, giving Zelda the bedroom to herself despite her protests. She lay awake for a long time in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the Texas night through the open window, the chirp of crickets, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through grass. Her hand rested on her belly, feeling the baby move beneath her palm, and she thought about the strange turn her life had taken. She had come to Fort Worth expecting to live a lie, to hide her pregnancy for as long as possible, and then claim the child was premature. Instead, she had confessed everything and found herself married to a man who promised to raise her baby as his own. It seemed too good to be true, and Zelda could not shake the fear that Samuel would change his mind once the reality of the situation truly set in. But as the days passed, Samuel proved himself to be a man of his word. He treated Zelda with unfailing courtesy and respect, giving her space to adjust to her new life while also making it clear that he considered them truly married. He was up before dawn each morning to tend to the cattle and horses, returning for breakfast that Zelda prepared with increasing confidence in the small kitchen. They fell into an easy routine, working together to maintain the house and ranch, talking more freely with each passing day. Zelda learned that Samuel was a man of few words but deep feelings, that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her by surprise, that he loved this land with a fierce passion that showed in everything he did. She told him about her life in Boston, about working as a seamstress after her parents died, about the loneliness that had made her vulnerable to the merchant's son's false promises. Samuel listened without judgment, and slowly, carefully, something like friendship began to grow between them. 3 weeks after their wedding, Zelda was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she felt a sharp pain in her lower back. She paused, one hand pressed to the aching spot, and took a deep breath. It was probably nothing, just the normal discomforts of pregnancy. But then the pain came again, stronger this time, and she felt a warm gush of liquid run down her legs. For a moment she stood frozen in confusion and terror, staring down at the puddle forming at her feet. "Sam," her voice came out thin and frightened. "Sam, something is wrong." He appeared around the corner of the house within seconds, his face going pale when he saw her. "What happened? Are you hurt? The baby? Something is happening with the baby. It is too soon. I am only 6 months along. It cannot be coming now." Panic clawed at her throat. Samuel scooped her up into his arms as though she weighed nothing and carried her into the house, laying her carefully on the bed. "I am going to ride into town and get the doctor. You stay right here. Do not move. I will be as quick as I can." "Do not leave me," Zelda gasped, clutching at his shirt as another wave of pain rolled through her. "Please, I am frightened." His jaw clenched, and she could see him warring with himself. "The doctor needs to be here, Zelda. You need help that I cannot give you. It is too far. He will not make it back in time." She could feel it in her bones. This baby was coming whether anyone was ready or not. "Please, Sam, do not make me go through this alone." He cursed under his breath, a string of words that Zelda had never heard from him before, but he stayed. He pulled a chair close to the bed and took her hand, his grip strong and steady. All right, I am here. Just tell me what you need." What followed were the longest hours of Zelda's life, a blur of pain and fear and Samuel's steady presence beside her. He brought her water and cool cloths for her forehead, held her hand through the contractions that came harder and faster, never flinching even when she squeezed his fingers so hard she thought she might break them. She had heard other women talk about childbirth, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it, the overwhelming pressure and the burning pain and the primal need to push. "I cannot do this," she sobbed at one point, exhausted and terrified. "It is too much. I cannot." "Yes, you can." Samuel's voice cut through her panic like a lifeline. "You are the strongest woman I have ever met, Zelda Norton. You can do this." Zelda Norton. Her married name spoken with such certainty that something inside her steadied. She bore down with the next contraction, gritting her teeth against the pain, and pushed with everything she had. Samuel moved to the foot of the bed, and she heard him make a startled sound. "I can see the head. Zelda, the baby is coming. You are almost there." 3 more pushing contractions that felt like they would tear her in half. And then suddenly, the pressure released all at once, and a thin, angry wail filled the room. Zelda collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face, and watched through blurred vision as Samuel carefully lifted a tiny, red-faced baby into his arms. "It is a boy," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You have got a son, Zelda." He wrapped the baby in a clean towel and brought him to her, laying the infant on her chest. Zelda cradled the impossibly small body, marveling at the perfect tiny fingers and the shock of dark hair on his head. He was so small, smaller than any baby she had ever seen, and his cries were weak and mewling. Fear clenched her heart. He came too early. Something is wrong with him. He is breathing and crying. That is a good sign. Samuel stroked one gentle finger down the baby's cheek. We will take care of him, keep him warm and fed. Babies are tougher than they look." Over the next few days, Zelda barely slept, terrified that if she closed her eyes for more than a moment, the baby would stop breathing. Samuel stayed close, helping her learn to nurse the infant, keeping the fire built up so the house stayed warm, bringing her food and water and clean cloths. The baby was so small that he seemed more like a doll than a real child, but he had a surprisingly strong will to live, latching onto her breast with determination and gradually growing stronger. On the fourth day, Samuel asked the question that had been hanging in the air between them. "What do you want to name him?" Zelda looked down at the sleeping infant in her arms, this child who had come into the world too soon and against all odds. "I do not know. I had not let myself think that far ahead. He needs a name, something strong to match his fighting spirit." She thought about it for a long moment, then looked up at Samuel. "Would you name him? You said you would be his father. I think the father should choose the name." Samuel's expression went soft in a way she had never seen before. He sat on the edge of the bed and studied the baby with serious eyes. "What about Thomas? It was my father's name, Tom Norton." "Thomas," Zelda repeated, testing the sound of it. "Yes, I think that is perfect." Samuel reached out and gently touched the baby's tiny hand, and Thomas's fingers curled reflexively around his. "Hello, Tom," he said softly. "Welcome to the family, son." Watching them together, Zelda felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. Samuel had not just accepted her child in theory. He was becoming a father right before her eyes, with all the tenderness and protectiveness that the role demanded. And somewhere along the way, without her quite noticing when it happened, she had stopped thinking of him as the stranger she had married out of desperation, and started thinking of him simply as her husband. As little Thomas grew stronger, the household settled into a new rhythm. Samuel fashioned a cradle out of an old crate and smooth wood, padding it with soft blankets so the baby had a safe place to sleep. He would often hold Thomas while Zelda prepared meals, talking to the infant in a low voice about the ranch and the cattle and the land they called home. The sight of this rough cowboy cradling such a tiny baby with infinite care did things to Zelda's heart that she could not quite name. Autumn arrived, painting the prairie in shades of gold and brown, and Thomas was 3 months old and thriving despite his early arrival. He had filled out into a chubby, healthy baby with bright eyes that seemed to track everything around him. Samuel doted on him shamelessly, making faces to coax out toothless smiles, and Zelda often caught herself watching the two of them with a feeling of contentment she had never expected to find. One evening after they had put Thomas down to sleep in his cradle, Zelda and Samuel sat together by the fire, the comfortable silence between them broken only by the crackle of burning wood. Zelda was mending one of Samuel's shirts, her needle flashing in the firelight, when he spoke. "I have been thinking," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Thomas is going to need a proper bed soon, a bigger one than that cradle, and we are going to need more room in general. I was thinking maybe I could add on to the house, build another bedroom or two." Zelda looked up from her sewing. "That sounds like a lot of work." "It would be, but I figure it is work worth doing." He met her eyes across the firelight. "If we are going to have a family, we need space for it to grow." Her heart skipped a beat. "Are you saying you want more children?" "I am saying I want a real marriage, Zelda, not just two people sharing a house. I want to build a life with you, a family. If that is something you want too." She set down her mending with trembling hands. They had been married for 4 months now, but Samuel had never pushed for more than she was ready to give, never demanded his rights as a husband. He had slept in the main room for weeks after Thomas's birth, only moving back to the bedroom when Zelda had finally insisted that it was all right. Even then, he had kept a respectful distance, lying on his side of the bed like there was an invisible line drawn down the middle. "I do want that," she said quietly. "I want it very much. You have been so good to me, Sam, so much better than I ever deserved. You took me in when I was desperate and alone. You accepted my child as your own, and you have never once made me feel ashamed of my past. I would be honored to truly be your wife, in every sense of the word." Samuel stood and crossed to where she sat, kneeling down so they were at eye level. His hands, rough and calloused from years of ranch work, cupped her face with infinite gentleness. "You deserve everything, Zelda Norton. Everything good in this world, and I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know that." When he kissed her, it was nothing like that chaste brush of lips at their wedding ceremony. This was deep and searching, full of all the want and need that had been building between them for months. Zelda kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his hair, and when he lifted her and carried her to the bedroom, she went willingly, eagerly, ready to finally make this marriage real in every way. Afterward, Zelda lay curled against Samuel's side, her head on his chest, listening to the steady thump of his heartbeat. His arm was wrapped around her, holding her close, and she had never felt so safe and cherished in her entire life. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I do not know when it happened, but I love you, Sam." His arm tightened around her. "I love you too. Have for a while now, if I am being honest, probably since the first time I saw you smile at Tom." She tilted her head up to look at him. "Really, really. You are an amazing mother, Zelda. And an amazing woman. I am the lucky one in this marriage, not you." "I think we are both lucky," she murmured, snuggling back against him. The following spring brought new life to the ranch in more ways than one. The cattle had their calves, the grass turned green and lush, and Zelda discovered she was pregnant again. This time there were no secrets, no shame, only joy as she and Samuel shared the news. Thomas was nearly a year old now, toddling around the expanded house on unsteady legs and babbling in his own mysterious language. Samuel had indeed added 2 more bedrooms to the house over the winter months, working through the coldest days to give them more space. "Another baby," Samuel said, his hand splayed across her still flat stomach with wonder in his eyes. "Our baby." "Thomas is your baby too," Zelda reminded him gently. "You are the only father he will ever know, I know, and I could not love him more if he was born of my blood, but this one." He trailed off, seeming to struggle for words. "This one we made together, that feels like something special." "It is special. You are special, Sam Norton." She kissed him softly. "And I cannot wait to see you with another child to spoil." This pregnancy was different from the first in every way. There was no fear, no need to hide, no terrible secret eating away at her conscience. Samuel was attentive to the point of being overprotective, insisting she rest more and not lift anything heavy, and Zelda found his concern touching even when it bordered on ridiculous. She felt healthy and strong, her body blooming with the new life inside her, and she spent the warm months of summer preparing tiny clothes and soft blankets for the baby while Thomas played at her feet. In October of 1877, Zelda gave birth to a daughter in the same bed where Thomas had been born, but this time with the doctor present, and Samuel holding her hand throughout. The labor was long but not frightening, and when their daughter finally arrived, perfect and wailing, Samuel actually had tears running down his face. "She is beautiful," he said hoarsely, staring at the red-faced infant like she was the most precious thing he had ever seen. "She looks just like you." They named her Sarah after Samuel's mother, and she became the darling of the household. Thomas, still quite young himself, was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to touch her soft hair and hold her tiny hand. Zelda watched her family with a heart so full it felt like it might burst, marveling at how drastically her life had changed in just 2 years. The ranch prospered as the seasons turned. Samuel's herd grew, and he hired on 2 full-time ranch hands to help with the work. He built a proper barn and expanded the house yet again, this time adding a front porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the prairie while the children played. Zelda planted a vegetable garden and learned to preserve food for the winter, to bake bread in the cast-iron Dutch oven, to shoot a rifle well enough to protect the homestead if Samuel was out with the cattle. When Sarah was 2 years old and Thomas nearly 4, Zelda found herself pregnant again. This time the news was met with laughter and excitement, both of them more confident in their ability to handle another child. They had learned so much in the past few years, had grown from uncertain strangers into a solid partnership built on love and trust and mutual respect. 3 children, Samuel marveled one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting on her swelling belly. We are going to have 3 children, Zelda. When I was alone on this ranch, I never imagined having so much family around me. Are you happy? She asked, though she could see the answer in his face every day. Happier than I have any right to be. He kissed her forehead, then her nose, then her lips. You gave me everything I did not know I wanted, Zelda Norton. A home full of love and laughter and life. I could not ask for more. Their 3rd child, another son they named Samuel Jr., but called by the nickname Sam Jr. to avoid confusion, arrived in the spring of 1880. He was a robust baby with a shock of reddish hair that came from Samuel's side of the family, and he had lungs that could wake the entire house when he wanted to be fed. Thomas and Sarah were old enough now to be real helpers, fetching diapers and entertaining their baby brother when Zelda needed a moment to rest. Life on the ranch was not always easy. There were droughts that threatened the cattle, hard winters that tested their endurance, occasional troubles with rustlers or predators. But through it all, Samuel and Zelda faced each challenge together, their bond growing stronger with every obstacle they overcame. The love that had started as a fragile spark of possibility had grown into something unshakable, a foundation upon which they built their entire lives. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Samuel surprised Zelda with a trip into Fort Worth, arranging for one of the ranch hands' wives to watch the children for the day. They dressed in their finest clothes and rode into town in the wagon, just as they had done on their wedding day, though everything felt different now. They were no longer strangers bound by desperation and circumstance. They were partners who knew each other's hearts as well as their own. Samuel took her to dinner at the new hotel restaurant that had opened in town, a luxury they rarely indulged in. Over roast beef and potatoes, they talked about everything and nothing, their conversation flowing as easily as it always did. Afterward, they walked along the boardwalk, Samuel's arm around her waist, and stopped outside the general store to look at the window display. "You ever regret it?" Samuel asked suddenly. "Marrying me, coming out here?" Zelda turned to look at him in surprise. "How could you even ask that?" "Sam, you gave me everything. You saved my life and Thomas's life. You gave us a home and a family and love beyond measure. I have never regretted a single moment of our marriage. I just want to make sure you are happy, that this life is enough for you." She reached up and touched his face, rough with evening stubble. "This life is more than enough. It is everything. You are everything, Sam Norton. I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." He smiled, that slow, rare smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "Good, because I plan on keeping you for at least another 50 years, maybe longer if I can manage it." "I think I can live with that," she said, and kissed him right there on the main street of Fort Worth, not caring who saw them. The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and growth. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved working alongside his father with the cattle. Sarah was bright and curious, always asking questions and wanting to learn everything about the world around her. Sam Jr. was the wild one, fearless and mischievous, keeping Zelda on her toes. Two more children joined the family, twins born in 1883, a boy and girl they named Jacob and Emma. The house rang with noise and chaos and love, every room filled with evidence of the family that called it home. Zelda had never told Thomas the truth about his birth, and as he grew older it seemed less and less important. Samuel was his father in every way that mattered. He had Samuel's mannerisms, his way of speaking, his love for the land. If anyone in town remembered that Zelda had arrived already pregnant, they kept it to themselves. Thomas Norton was accepted as Samuel's eldest son without question, and that was all that mattered. On a warm summer evening in 1886, when Thomas was 10 years old and asking to learn how to break horses, Samuel finally told Zelda something he had been holding back for years. They were sitting on the porch after the children had gone to bed, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Zelda was knitting a blanket for Emma, her hands moving automatically while she enjoyed the peaceful evening. Samuel reached over and stilled her hands, taking the knitting and setting it aside. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice serious enough to make her heart clench with worry. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing is wrong. I just realized that I have never told you this and you deserve to know." He took both her hands in his. "That day we got married, when you told me about being pregnant with Thomas, about the merchant's son back in Boston, I already knew." Zelda stared at him in shock. "What do you mean you knew?" Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house. She has a sharp eye. "She pulled me aside that morning before the wedding and told me she thought you might be in a family way, asked if I knew what I was getting into. I told her I did. But I did not tell you until we were in the wagon after the ceremony. I know. And I let you think that you were confessing a secret because I could see how much courage it took for you to tell me the truth. But Zelda, I need you to understand, it did not matter to me then and it does not matter to me now. I married you knowing about the baby, and I would make the same choice 100 times over." Tears filled her eyes. "Why did you not say anything?" "Because you needed to tell me yourself. You needed to know that you had that courage. And I wanted you to hear me say that I would raise Thomas as my own, not because I was tricked into it or trapped, but because I chose to. I wanted you to know that it was my decision, freely made." Zelda launched herself into his arms, knocking him back in his chair. "I love you so much," she said fiercely, her words muffled against his chest. "You impossible, wonderful man, I love you." He held her close, his lips in her hair. "I love you too, always have, always will." As their children grew, the ranch continued to thrive. Samuel taught all of them to ride and rope and work with cattle, not caring that tradition said the girls should stay in the house. He believed in teaching his children to be capable and self-sufficient, and Zelda supported him wholeheartedly. Sarah developed a particular gift for training horses, while Emma showed an early talent for numbers that Samuel said would make her invaluable when it came time to handle the ranch accounts. Thomas, as the eldest, gradually took on more and more responsibility. By the time he was 16, he was essentially Samuel's partner in running the ranch, tall and strong and so much like the man who raised him that strangers often commented on the resemblance. Zelda sometimes caught herself watching them work together and marveling at the bond between them, the easy communication of two people who understood each other perfectly. One spring morning, in 1892, a well-dressed stranger rode up to the ranch house and asked to speak with Zelda. Samuel was out checking fence lines with Thomas and Jacob, so Zelda received the visitor alone, a sense of unease prickling at the back of her neck. The man removed his hat and introduced himself as a lawyer from Boston. "I am trying to locate a woman named Zelda Crawford, who left Boston in 1876. I was told she might have come to this area." Zelda's blood ran cold. "I am Zelda Norton, formerly Crawford. What is this about?" The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "I represent the estate of Charles Whitmore. He passed away 3 months ago and left a considerable sum of money to any child he may have fathered outside of his marriage. There were rumors that he had a relationship with a seamstress named Zelda Crawford, and that she left town, possibly pregnant. If that child exists and can be proven to be his offspring, they would be entitled to a substantial inheritance." The name hit Zelda like a physical blow. Charles Whitmore, the merchant's son who had promised her the world and then abandoned her. The father of her firstborn child who had never wanted anything to do with them. And now, 16 years later, he was trying to reach from beyond the grave and claim Thomas. "I do not know what you are talking about," Zelda said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "I have been married to Samuel Norton since 1876, and all my children are his. You have wasted your time coming here." The lawyer looked skeptical. "Mrs. Norton, I have records showing that you left Boston in June of 1876, approximately 5 months before a child was born here in Fort Worth. The timing suggests nothing except that I married quickly and had my first child within a year of my marriage, which is hardly unusual." Zelda stood, making it clear the conversation was over. "My husband and my son will be back soon, and I do not think they will appreciate you making these accusations. I suggest you leave now." The lawyer hesitated, clearly wanting to press further, but something in Zelda's expression made him reconsider. He left his card on the table and departed, riding back toward town with several backward glances at the house. Zelda stood on the porch, her hands shaking, and watched him go. When Samuel and Thomas rode in an hour later, she told them everything. Thomas listened in silence, his young face serious and thoughtful, while Samuel's expression grew darker with every word. "He cannot take me away, can he?" Thomas asked when Zelda finished. "I do not want to go to Boston. I do not want anything from that man." "No one is taking you anywhere," Samuel said firmly. "You are my son, legally and in every other way that matters. Some stranger's money does not change that. But he was my real father." Thomas looked between them, confusion and hurt in his eyes. Was he not? Zelda moved to her son and cupped his face in her hands. "He was the man whose blood you share, but he was never your father. Your father is standing right there." She nodded toward Samuel. "The man who chose to raise you, who taught you everything you know, who has loved you every day of your life. That is what makes a father, Thomas, not biology." Thomas turned to Samuel, something vulnerable in his expression. "Is that true? Am I really your son, even though we are not related by blood?" Samuel crossed the room and put his hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You are my son in every way that counts. I held you when you were born. I walked the floor with you when you were sick. I taught you to ride and rope and run this ranch. I love you, Tom, just as much as I love your brothers and sisters. Nothing and no one can change that." Thomas threw his arms around Samuel, holding tight, and Zelda saw tears glistening in her husband's eyes as he hugged their son back. In that moment, she knew that whatever money or claim the Whitmore estate thought they had, it meant nothing compared to the bonds that had been forged in this house over 16 years of love and life together. The lawyer came back twice more, each time met with firm refusals from all three of them. Finally, Samuel hired his own lawyer in Fort Worth, who made it clear that any further harassment would be met with legal action. The Whitmore estate eventually gave up, presumably finding it easier to distribute the inheritance among Charles's legitimate children than to fight a family who clearly wanted nothing to do with their money or their name. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it ever was, with 5 active children and a working ranch to run. Thomas seemed settled in his identity, more confident than ever in his place in the family. He never asked about Charles Whitmore again, and Zelda never brought it up. The past was the past, and it had no power over the present they had built together. The children continued to grow and thrive. Sarah fell in love with a neighboring rancher's son when she was 18, a kind young man named Daniel Carter who asked Samuel's permission to court her properly. Samuel grilled the poor boy thoroughly before agreeing, but even Zelda could see he approved of the match. They married in the fall of 1893, with Sarah radiant in a dress Zelda had sewn herself, and built a house on the far corner of the Norton ranch land that Samuel had given them as a wedding present. Thomas married 2 years later, choosing a spirited red-headed girl named Margaret from town who could ride and shoot as well as any man. They took over the day-to-day running of the ranch, allowing Samuel to finally slow down a bit, though he would never fully retire. He loved the work too much, loved the land and the cattle and the life they had built there. As Samuel and Zelda grew older, their love only deepened. They had weathered storms, both literal and figurative, had raised 5 children from infancy to adulthood, had built a successful ranch and a legacy that would continue through their grandchildren. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the prairie, their hands clasped together, content in the knowledge that they had lived a good life together. "You remember that first day?" Zelda asked one evening when they were both well into their 50s and grandchildren played in the yard before them. "When I got off that stagecoach, so terrified and desperate," Samuel squeezed her hand. "I remember thinking you looked like you might bolt at any moment, like a scared rabbit." "I very nearly did, if you had not been so kind, so understanding. If I had not been so lonely and desperate for family," he countered with a smile. "We were both taking a chance on each other, Zelda. I am just grateful it worked out the way it did." She leaned her head on his shoulder, watching Thomas and Margaret's first child, a boy they had named Samuel after his grandfather, toddle after a chicken in the yard. Sarah and Daniel's twin daughters were helping Emma gather eggs, their piping voices carrying across the evening air. Jacob, now a tall young man of 15, was teaching Sam Jr. how to properly care for his saddle. It was a scene of pure domestic contentment, the kind of life Zelda had never dared to dream of when she was alone and pregnant and terrified in Boston all those years ago. "I love you, Sam Norton," she said softly. "Thank you for giving me this life. Thank you for saying yes to raising Thomas when you had every reason to say no. Thank you for being the man you are." He turned and kissed her temple, his lips soft against her graying hair. "Thank you for taking a chance on a lonely cowboy. Thank you for building this family with me. Thank you for loving me, even when I did not deserve it." "You always deserved it," she insisted, "from the very first day." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple, Samuel and Zelda sat together on the porch of the house he had built with his own hands, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had created together. It had not been an easy journey, and it had certainly not been the one either of them had planned. But it had been theirs, forged from desperation and kindness into something beautiful and lasting. Thomas rode up to the house just as full darkness fell, dismounting and climbing the porch steps to stand before his parents. He was a man now, 20 years old and confident in who he was, but there was still something boyish in the way he looked at Samuel. Pa, there is a section of fence down on the north pasture. I think we should replace the whole line rather than just patch it. What do you think? Samuel nodded thoughtfully. I think you are right. We can start on it tomorrow, get it done before the weather turns. I will have the materials ready at first light. Thomas tipped his hat to Zelda. Good night, Ma. Love you both. Love you too, son, they said in unison, and watched him walk back to the house he shared with Margaret on the other side of the property. Zelda felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind, the kind that came from a heart too full to contain all the happiness it held. Her son, raised by a man who had chosen to love him when he had no obligation to do so, had grown into someone wonderful. Her husband, who had taken a chance on a pregnant stranger, had become the center of her entire world. Her family, built from such unlikely beginnings, had flourished beyond anything she could have imagined. I think we did all right, Samuel said quietly, as though reading her thoughts. With Thomas, with all of them, I think we did all right. We did better than all right, Zelda said, wiping at her eyes. We did something miraculous, Sam. We built a love story out of desperation and lies and fear and turned it into something real and true and lasting. That is more than all right. That is extraordinary. He pulled her close, and they sat together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of their grandchildren playing in the house, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the grass. This was their legacy, not just the land and the ranch, but the love they had created and nurtured and passed on to the next generation. This was what mattered in the end. Not how their story had begun, but how they had chosen to write it together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, until they had created something beautiful and permanent. Years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow, as is the way of all lives. Samuel's hair turned completely white, and Zelda's hands grew stiff with arthritis, but their love remained constant. They celebrated births and marriages, weathered illnesses and losses, and through it all, they faced everything together, just as they had promised on that long-ago day in the little church in Fort Worth. When Samuel finally passed away in 1905 at the age of 57, worn out from a life of hard work and simple pleasures, Zelda held his hand as he took his last breath. Their children surrounded the bed, all 5 of them present to say goodbye to the man who had shaped their lives so profoundly. Thomas wept openly, his grief raw and honest, and Zelda drew strength from knowing that the bond between father and son had been so deep and true. "I love you," Samuel whispered with his final breath, his eyes on Zelda. "Always, always," she promised, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Zelda lived another 15 years, spending her days surrounded by children and grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren, the house always full of the noise and laughter of family. She never remarried, never wanted to. Samuel had been her one great love, the man who had saved her and then loved her beyond measure. How could anyone else compare? She told the story of their beginning only once, to her granddaughter named Zelda after her, who asked how she and grandfather Samuel had met. Sitting on the old porch that had weathered 4 decades of seasons, the old woman told the tale of a desperate journey, a kind cowboy, and a baby born too soon who had been loved as fiercely as any child could be. "Your grandfather was the best man I ever knew," she concluded, her voice wavering with age but still strong in its conviction. "He taught me that family is not about blood, but about choice, about showing up every day and choosing to love even when it is hard, especially when it is hard. That is the legacy I want to leave to all of you." When Zelda Norton passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1920, she was buried next to Samuel on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. Her children, all of them prosperous and happy, stood together at her grave and remembered the woman who had loved them so completely, who had built a life of substance and meaning from such broken beginnings. Thomas, now 44 years old with children and grandchildren of his own, was the last to leave the graveside. He stood between his parents' headstones and thought about the life they had given him, the love they had shown him, the man his father had been to choose him as a son. Samuel Norton had not just raised another man's child. He had created a family and a legacy that would continue for generations. He had taken a scared, pregnant woman and given her safety and love and a future. He had been, in every sense of the word, a hero. "Thank you, Pa," Thomas said quietly to the stone. "Thank you for choosing us. Thank you for being my father." The wind whispered through the prairie grass, carrying with it the scent of cattle and earth and home, and somewhere in that wind, Thomas could almost hear his father's voice saying what he had said so many times in life. "You are my son, in every way that counts." And that, in the end, was the truest thing of all. The Norton Ranch continued to thrive, passed down through generations, each one telling the story of Samuel and Zelda, the cowboy who said, "I will raise it," and the woman who came to him pregnant with another man's child. It became a family legend, a testament to the transformative power of love and choice and commitment. It reminded every Norton child that family was not about where you came from, but about who chose to love you and raise you and stand by you through all of life's challenges. And in the quiet moments, when descendants stood on that same porch and looked out over the land their ancestors had tended, they could feel the love that had started it all. The love between a desperate woman and a kind cowboy who had seen past her circumstances to the person she was, and the life they could build together. That love had created something that endured beyond death, beyond time, beyond anything the world could throw at it. It had created home.